distributing it alongside, there you go, alongside a PDF copy and version of the slide deck there. You'll also get the opportunity to sign up to BOGL's upcoming regulatory updates in financial crime compliance and all things regulatory that are important and impacting you as an organization by elephants. Don't forget there, we're going to be covering a number of key themes there. I apologize in advance, but I don't apologize in a way, because I know we've got lots of issues to cover off there. If we don't have time to actually answer your question, we'll take that offline, and the panelists have agreed that they will actually answer that directly to you. So don't worry if we run out of steam or run out of time, or both, by the end of this webinar, because we'll actually manage that there. So we're going to be talking about what the top risks, financial crime compliance risks are in your firm, your organization, how we can adapt the regulatory changes to your business there. Also, the role of importance of AI there. And also we'll be looking at future sanctions policies. How can you get ahead of the regulator in 2024 and beyond there? We always like to kickstart our webinars with a poll question. So it'd be great if we could actually get to your feedback and on this of one of the most important questions that you'll probably be able to pose this year, which is, what are your financial crime issues and priorities in 2024? We've ranked those in order of importance, 1 being most important, 5 being least important there. So resources to develop a sustainable AML framework, detecting and mitigating APP fraud, effectively tackling cyber-enabled crime, leveraging new technologies to identify risks, and shifting sanctions regulations as well, alongside terrorist financing and others. Now, if you have any other issues or challenges, please let us know in the chat and we'll be able to answer those effectively there. So welcome, Mark. It's never dull in the life of a financial compliance professional, is it?
I think there's the may you live in interesting times problem for financial crime compliance professionals. At the moment, we've got a number of geopolitical challenges. I think it's safe to say, sanctions being top of everybody's mind probably at the moment, and you know, we've got point E down there, shifting sanctions. They're being used more often in more situations than ever before, and particularly firms that deal internationally, maybe have subsidiaries abroad, they'll have some pretty complex interlinking and overlapping sanctions obligations. And we're going to come on to detecting and mitigating APP fraud in a minute. But you know, the point about being in a compliance department, and particularly financial crime department in the UK at the moment, is that you have to keep on top of both the regulatory challenges, but also the environmental changes out there. And whether that is that geopolitical risk, whether that is criminals coming up with new ways to attempt to defraud your customers, or it's money launderers using new and novel instruments like crypto to you know, launder money. Yeah, never a dull moment.
And Felix, when you look at these results here, thank you very much for participating in the poll. You see that resources to develop a sustainable AML framework, top of the pops there, and shifting sanctions regulations. That's what Mark suggested as well there. Is that what you're seeing from your clients?
Absolutely, and that kind of comes back to that kind of balance between regulatory challenges and environmental effects that Mark was talking about. I think it's important we view each of these topics as sort of interconnected rather than as discrete entities. Let's take sanctions as a particular example. We're seeing increased focus on the FCA on sanctions at the moment. The FCA is expecting an increase in a technological approach to sanctions, which obviously ties into that new technologies aspect, which the industry is kind of going through at the moment. With new technology comes increased resourcing challenges. So, for example, many firms are going through systems calibrations at the moment. For previously manageable processes that output a certain number of outcomes, let's say a sanctions screening system outputting a certain number of alerts, are now outputting many more. Firms that need to consider whether they have the resources to handle those outcomes, and also whether they have the right resources with the right skills and experience. Again, previous sort of keep throwing bodies at an issue may not work so well in a new technological environment. So firms are sort of struggling to find those staff with that appropriate level of technical expertise.
Probably what you're seeing as well. Lots of nods from you, Adrian, on that point that Felix just made.
Yeah, I think employee competence is a critical success factor in the war against these criminals. The point that I zoomed in on here was cybercrime, and I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later, because this for me is a glaring open back door for a lot of firms, where they can put a lot of effort in at the front end and leave the back door open. So we're going to come back and cover this. So yes, competence, I think, will come up, or employee competence will come up again and again.
And when we look at need to know regulation, we could spend a lot of time on this. And Mark, you've already raised the issue of APP fraud there. FCA said they were disappointed, didn't they, at the end of last year with payment service firms' anti-fraud money controls?
Yeah, they did. So when they did their review, which we've highlighted on this slide, they found, not unsurprisingly, that they weren't happy with the approach that firms have been taking. APP fraud is one of those areas that has been growing, you could say exponentially over the last few years. It is, a key vulnerability within the payment system. What I think has slightly changed as well is that we have new consumer duty. And to Felix's point earlier, you can't really see these things in isolation. The new consumer duty pushes payment firms who are offering essentially that service, that you can use their services without fear of being defrauded yourself. They need to bring that within their thinking on consumer duty, because it is essentially the service that they are providing. And that's a very slight, or someone might say more than slight, more slightly fundamental change in how you need to think about these fraud areas, from being basically just a pure financial crime and loss subject, to bringing it within your concept of providing a service. You're providing a safe service that gives the customer the outcome, which is they move their money from A to B, from the right person to the right person. And then if they do fall victim of fraud, then you deal with it appropriately. And I think that's the sort of the flip side to this one, is that when something has happened, you deal with it appropriately. You said there that they weren't that happy with the anti-fraud controls, and I think that is, Adrian used the sort of the word war. The war on the criminals and the people that are trying to defraud customers is ever changing, and they will find ways around whatever controls we put in place. And really, the point of what the PSR, the Payment Service Regulator, is trying to do here is to share the burden of loss appropriately between both participants in the payments industry, so the industry participants, and also innocent victims not being essentially held to account for something that the firm arguably could have prevented. So I think it's a really interesting development with the intersection of what people would typically call sort of normal compliance, regulatory compliance and financial crime compliance coming together to really hold firms' toes to the fire. There's the sort of the other mention in there, as ever, around governance and MI, and really trying to get the boards to put effort into it. I think we'll see the regulator pushing where they think that boards or oversight functions haven't taken appropriate steps. I've certainly seen a number of supervisory interactions, including Section 166, is around this area where the regulator has seen that there has been a higher incidence of APP fraud at a particular firm. They've then intervened pretty harshly with those firms.
Yeah,
great. Sorry, Felix, just before you jump in there on that. Great, if you've got raising your hands, please post the questions in the Q&A chat, and so we can manage and monitor those as we go on. Sorry, Felix.
That's an interesting point, Mark. And I think one aspect I want to stress as well is if the FCA is finding that firms are currently struggling with the current regime for APP fraud, things are about to get a hell of a lot more complicated. So we're seeing the adjustments to FSMA, which will come into effect in October this year, which will include sort of increased requirements for firms to reimburse customers who become defrauded. There'll be adjustment to the claim limit to around £400,000, and also requirements that where customers are found to have been defrauded, firms implement a swifter turnaround for reimbursing those customers, getting funds back to them within a 5-day time frame. So things are about to get a lot more complicated for firms in that space as well.
Thanks for that cheerful news, Felix. On that, do you want to continue the good news with the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, or this ECCTA?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, ECCTA obviously passed into law last year, theoretically coming into effect on Boxing Day last year. Various elements of it will require a form of statutory implementation. We expect to see more elements coming through this quarter, but some of the elements of the ECCTA will take until 2025 to put through. A key example there is the new failure to prevent fraud offence, which we're expecting to see in 2025 coming into law. So that's, I guess, the one area of good news, is that firms will have a bit of time to adjust to the new changes that the ECCTA is bringing through in a few cases. Of course, we would recommend that firms get ahead of these changes wherever possible now. And I think most important of all, are aware of what the changes are. I think one of the areas which is most concerning for firms, although it is furthest away in terms of implementation, is that failure to prevent fraud offence. Yeah. I think it's seen as sort of big and scary because obviously it comes associated with a criminal penalty. And effectively, what that sort of means for firms is the firm will be held criminally liable under this offence in instances where either the firm itself or a key person associated with the firm, and that could be an employee, an agent, or an employee or agent of a subsidiary, or anyone who performs services for or on behalf of that firm, commits a fraud offence, where that offence has been perpetrated in order to benefit the organisation. So it's extremely broad, and it kind of extremely sort of powerful in terms of its ability to kind of reach through that corporate veil and sort of really consider who within a firm might be committing fraud. I guess the one silver lining for that offence is it does only apply to the largest firms out there. So there are three criteria that the government will be sort of viewing this through. So the firm has to satisfy two of these three aspects. So either a turnover of more than 36 million, total assets of more than 18 million, or an average of more than 250 employees. I think that sort of scope will apply to many of the individuals on this call today, but it's just worth reflecting on the fact that it is only sort of the medium and larger firms who will be affected by these changes immediately. Although we should note that the legislation does provide room for the expansion of this offence to cover all forms of corporates, and that's something which we're keeping a close eye on, that potential expansion of scope.
And ECCTA doesn't stop at fraud; it also extends a mark into companies' house reforms and corporate criminal liability as well.
Absolutely. So, yeah, one of the bigger changes that we're seeing in the ECCTA is the change in the role of companies' house. Again, we're expecting that to sort of be cemented into law sort of this quarter. So companies' house will have new powers to check, remove information submitted to companies' house, or again, decline information submitted to the register. There are increased verification requirements for directors, other persons of significant control, and individuals who file on behalf of entities. So again, huge shift in how how Companies House will operate. And then finally, there's a few other things in the ECTA which firms definitely need to be keeping an eye on. Again, reforming the test for corporate criminal liability, and also significant changes to how limited partnerships operate. This area has been viewed for years as a sort of an area which criminals can exploit for the purposes of perpetrating financial crime. So the government is really clamping down on this legal form in particular.
And if that's not all, Mark, we've got a lot on the horizon and things coming down the pipeline there that our firms need to be aware of.
Yeah, so I think we'll touch on the anti-corruption piece in a sec, but I wanted to just think through some of the scenarios we've seen with our clients in the last couple of months. The tempo of the FCA's supervision has increased. We've seen a fair number of supervisory interventions, and whether that is, as it were, routine, so something based on an AML inspection or review type rota, or it's slightly more pointed. So we've highlighted here treatment of domestic PEPs, and we did that because we've seen a few firms slightly tie themselves in knots over the new or not so new approach to domestic PEPs. So essentially where you have to do enhanced due diligence on your PEP, but you can have essentially medium, low risk and high risk PEPs. And where this has really started to intersect, I think, with the AML supervision by the FCA is in your rep crim. So those of you who have to do a rep crim will know that it's got various fields, some of which are not entirely clear on their definitions. So we've seen a few firms put in the wrong number of high-risk clients or PEPs in their rep crim, and then the FCA following that up and questioning it, or the firm realizing they've made a mistake and they have to then put in a sub-fin, and then off they go to have a slightly different conversation with the FCA. But I think it's fair to say in most of the sectors, the FCA sector letters have said that financial crime is still one of their priorities, and it's it depends on the sector, but for example, the wealth sector, wealth and platforms sectors, got some pretty aggressive letters from the FCA about this. So I think it's fair to say that that the supervisory interactions that you'll be having, the number and intensity will probably increase during 2024. And that's before we add in the various sort of I suppose legislation and regulatory changes that Felix was just talking about there, and I think you can give us a good overview of what's coming down the pipe on those two that we've highlighted there, Felix.
Yes, absolutely. Just as a final point on the sort of domestic PEPs front, I think it's very important to recognise, as you have, the operational impact this sort of the changes in the definitions will have on firms. You've mentioned rep crims. Obviously, firms will need to revisit their enterprise-wide risk assessments and the customer risk assessments, make sure that those changes are represented in those risk assessments. The FCA has been very, very clear. The ML regs are very, very clear that a lower level of risk does need to be applied to domestic PEPs. And so the FCA will be checking that fact within firms' customer risk assessments. I think another aspect as well, which will be really interesting, is in June this year, we're expecting to see the outcomes of an ongoing FCA review into how firms are handling the domestic PEPs. And that will be very interesting just to see kind of a holistic picture of how firms are actually managing the risks associated with PEPs, whether they're applying the definition of PEPs correctly, whether risk assessments are proportional, whether they're taking the right decisions when rejecting PEPs or closing accounts, and how effective their communication is with these PEPs. So we're looking forward to seeing the outcomes of that in, I think it's in June.
Correct.
So just to talk then about the anti-corruption strategy, again, this is something which we're still sort of waiting to hear a little bit more from the government. Effectively, one of the sort of the big changes we're expected to see set out in the anti-corruption strategy, which is due this year, based on some of the sort of debates and conversations we're seeing in Parliament is a shift in definition, a shift in culture around the definition of corruption. So previously, corruption was defined as the abuse of office or position to benefit a third party in return for payment or other reward. Again, very clear economic focus there. We're seeing a shift potentially to a new definition, the abuse of entrusted power for private benefit that usually breaches laws, regulations, standards of integrity, or other standards of professional behavior. Again, a removal of that sort of quite clear association with direct economic benefit, which obviously is a reflection of some of the big stories we've seen in the media over the last couple of years. So firms need to be aware of that change in that potential change in the definition of corruption, and sort of be mindful of that potentially coming through over the course of this year. Finally, let's just talk about the changes to the supervisory regime for AML and CTF. So as Mark alluded to, we are seeing a sort of a shift in how the FCA operates, a shift towards a more technological approach to supervision, greater cooperation within the UK between different authorities, between the FCA in this country and authorities abroad. We're also expecting to see some sort of more dramatic changes potentially to the AML supervisory landscape in the UK. There was a consultation issued by the government in June, which put forward 4 potential models for AML supervision in the UK going forward. Effectively, I'm not going to go into the details of these models, but it's the future could look very different to what it looks like today. So we could see anything from something similar to the current framework, where we have various different authorities, the FCA, Gambling Commission, smaller authorities like the Solicitors, the Solicitors Regulation Authority. Or we could see a move towards a more centralized system with either some of those smaller bodies amalgamated together, or potentially even the creation of an entirely new single authority with responsibility for AML supervision. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that changes, how that information is released over the course of this year.
That's a good roundup. Thank you, Felix and Mark. We can't go anywhere these days without seeing, hearing, understanding, or not understanding the role and importance of AI. Adrian, it really garners quite a lot of attention nowadays, and certainly does for professionals registered and logged into this webinar. Your thoughts as a co-leader of an AI tech firm?
Yeah, obviously I hear it probably more than most of people's, I guess, cynicism, yeah, and concerns and worries. And somebody posted in the chat, sorry, I missed the name, posted in the chat about our compliance professionals going to have to become coders and understand what's in the code to rule out bias and things like that. I mean, the short answer is no. Yeah, the suppliers have just got to get better. If they're giving you the code, they're giving you their IP. Yeah, and they're not going to do that. So there's an inherent contest or friction between those suppliers and what I guess firms want to achieve. There are smart ways that can be achieved, and I think the technology is moving on. We're at the very early stages of the adoption curve. That said, what we see with our customers is that AI can do lots of things. One, it can process, like we've got on the screen, it can process millions of transactions. But I think the biggest win is around mitigating risk. And those risks appear from many different parts of the organization. And one of the areas that we're focused on is the risk arising from people. So, to what extent are you using artificial intelligence to help you quantify and mitigate risks arising from your people? Because in this war, in my words, against the criminals who are very, very sophisticated, your people are your first line of defense. And if they are not competent, they're presenting a huge risk to your organization. Can you quantify it? Most firms can't. And for me, that is just it's a wide open door. So yeah, we'll come back to this area of competence and the use of AI for different things. But whoever posted the previous comment, you don't need to be coders, but ultimately suppliers have got to come to the party and help you understand the mechanics of how that artificial intelligence works, so you can rule out those bias points. Does that help, Philip?
Yeah, definitely. Mark, Felix, when you're working with clients, making recommendations to organizations, are you seeing firms large and small looking at AI as part of their tech stack in their AML compliance?
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing firms starting to adopt it. I think to Adrian's point, we're not at mass adoption yet, but certainly in high volume areas within the retail banking industry in particular, you're seeing a lot of uptake and investment in ways to make the framework more effective and efficient. And this is one of the ways that firms are investing to do that. Felix, I think you've seen this sharpen quite recently.
Absolutely, and I think there's sort of two key areas that firms are sort of using artificial intelligence at the moment. So either firms are using it directly to manage risk, so sort of embedding AI systems within existing processes like transaction monitoring, customer screening for PEPs, adverse media, and sanctions, or they're kind of using it as a sort of in a sort of secondary basis. So not directly to identify risk events, but to again streamline the process of what happens once those risk events have been identified. So, for example, sort of working through large quantities of false positives in transaction monitoring or customer screening, through to sort of simplifying the process of transforming artifacts like financial crime policies and procedures into actual workable process documents. We're seeing lots of firms using AI just to kind of reduce the workload, take advantage of AI to reduce headcounts and improve sort of their ability to kind of manage this the kind of growing complexity of the AML landscape. I think, and one other sort of area I want to mention as well is preparation of SAR reports, which is currently can be a very time-consuming area for entities. So taking the vast quantity of structured data that's produced by screening and monitoring systems and turning it into a written report. That's one area where we're seeing AI used very effectively. I think a key problem that firms are having with AI technology for the first of those two areas, in terms of monitoring for risks, is the fact that most AI operates as a kind of a black box model. It's a non-deterministic way to identify risk. You put in the same inputs twice, you might get a different result both times. One effective way around that is, again, using AI, again, not directly to monitor for risk, but to design additional tools to monitor for risk. So there's no reason why your AI transaction monitoring system needs to directly look for incidents of financial crime. It could automatically generate you deterministic traditional transaction monitoring rules, which you can then implement in traditional transaction monitoring systems. And I think just
gotcha.
final just a final point on AI as well. I just want to reflect on the fact that we've talked a lot today about the use of AI for managing risk. I think it's important to reflect that the criminals are also using AI as part of their efforts to perpetrate financial crime. We've seen the use of LLMs, large language models, to generate false information for fake customers, to even generate sort of fake IDs and pictures of customers in order to create sort of spoof accounts at financial institutions. So again, as fast as the industry is moving, the criminals are in some cases moving equally fast.
Okay. Mark, I mean, in recent years, the FCA has been focusing on how it can avoid the need to take enforcement action against firms by trying to instill good practices but it's shown over the recent months and years that it's not afraid to discipline firms in pretty harsh ways, whether that's through, you alluded to the November Dear CEO letter, which was quite impactful to stockbroking firms as wealth management firms, but also stepping up supervisory visits there. More of the same, 2024?
More of the same, and I think there's been some chat around we haven't seen the level of fines that we would have expected in the last year, etc., etc. So some of these outcomes were down, but I think, and I hate to bring up the COVID thing again, but I think you had a bit of a dislocation in the tempo of enforcement and the capacity of the regulator to put cases through. And so typically cases take a couple of years to come to grind through the legal and regulatory gears. So I think you're seeing now, somewhat normal service being restored, and then of course going beyond that and increasing that over time, as we alluded to earlier. But there's some pretty interesting, surprising bits of stats on this slide around the number of investigations open and how many are, in particular, these dual track ones where we might go down the criminal route, or we might stick in the regulatory piece. But I think you're right. The use of supervisory powers like VRECs certainly increased. Section 166 is then after the VREC has gone in. We've certainly seen an uptick over the last few months. So typically we're seeing the regulator find out something about the firm, whatever it is, they take issue with it. Maybe it's a piece of data. They put in place pretty quickly a VREC, normally to stop the problem getting bigger. And then they do something like put in place a Section 166, unless you can get in front of it. And I would say this, but you get in an independent firm to do basically essentially what you can call a shadow 166. You get right ahead of it and you try and head them off at the pass and fix and demonstrate that you can address, you've recognized and can address and fix the problem that the regulator has detected with your firm.
And the approach has to change, Adrian, next year. I mean, obviously, Sarah's been watching Elephants Don't Forget's webinars over the last 12 months and listening to you beat the drum about compliance is not a tick box exercise there. Are firms getting the message about that new approach, or a different approach, I should say?
I think so. We've been doing this 11th year, and I think in the last 12 months we've seen the greatest sea change of more about compliance professionals rather than the learning and development functions, really questioning the authenticity of this approach, and does it actually fuel a credible first line of defence? Because ticking a box is essentially saying that first line of defence doesn't exist. Yeah, putting all of the emphasis on the second line. You're not going to win this war. You're just not going to win this war. You actually do need genuinely competent people. So ticking a box, the regulator's been banging that drum for some time, and we said plenty of Dear CEO letters that referenced it last year. So yeah, it's changing, Philip, and more firms are recognising their people are either part of the problem or part of the solution, and the smart ones are working out that they're part of the solution, but they need to change the way they do things.
Yeah, correct. And we've seen fewer fines, Mark, in the last year, but there are still key messages that the regulator is picking up from organisations that are still below par or substandard. And it's the same issues, different year though, isn't it?
I think it is, but also there's a subtle or not so subtle shift in which parts of our industry are being targeted by the regulator. So for many years, you used to see multi-million pound fines targeted at banks, and in the last year we've seen commodity brokers, we've seen wealth managers being targeted, and so the and payments firms, and so the regulators' sights have shifted, and what they're finding, I think, is that people in those other sectors that they haven't been bearing down on haven't really learned the lessons of the banking industry. So if you look at the payments sector, we've highlighted already the payments sector, but I think it's worth thinking about where the risk has shifted. The payment sector was relatively modest 10 years ago when some of these fines really started hitting home. Now, of course, they've taken a big chunk of that payments business from banks, and that competition, though, has then shifted the risk into that sector and out of the banking sector. And so the regulator is concentrating on them. We've seen a lot of De-risking, debanking, that's been a real sort of topic over the last few years. And where do those clients go? Well, they go to payment firms. And so where then the riskier client goes, there goes the regulator as well. Shouldn't really come as much surprise that they're going there. And then they're looking at places that have traditionally seen themselves as probably slightly lower risk in this money laundering value chain. So that commodities firm that I highlighted there would traditionally have probably seen themselves as slightly removed from the real sort of sharp end of payments and banking and things like that. But obviously the regulator is making a point about all participants in the market in its widest sense have to take their responsibilities seriously and make sure that they're actually seeing through the sort of regulatory priorities.
Okay. Felix, systems and controls, is that what you're seeing? Ongoing monitoring after, say initial client onboarding, ongoing monitoring of that, still an issue, still a challenge for firms to get their heads around, or is it more than that?
No, absolutely. It's obviously an area which keeps us very busy. It's an area many of our clients, many of the entities within the industry we speak to struggle with. I think of the sort of the broad area that is ongoing monitoring, one area of real focus at the moment is making sure that firms are getting their transaction monitoring right. Again, we're seeing a shift away from sort of traditional approaches to transaction monitoring, where you have 10 to 20 sort of static transaction monitoring rules in place, which maybe are calibrated according to different customer segments you have in place at your firm, but generally operate similarly from client to client. We're seeing a shift away from that to, as we should, to profile-driven, behavioral-driven monitoring, network analysis, and even in some cases, the use of artificial intelligence to detect and react to specific markers of risk. It's a very fast-moving area, and we're seeing lots of firms kind of in sort of continuous discussion with potential vendors to try and figure out for their firm what approach from that kind of menu of potential approaches is appropriate for them.
Okay, so let's move on to our second poll question. So why are firms, in your opinion, still struggling to meet their financial crime compliance obligations? So you can give as many answers or suggestive answers to this question as you like. Reliant on manual processes, budget constraints, increasing complexity of threats, growing volume of data to analyze, weak AML culture, resourcing, skills gaps of staff, unaware of the actual risks. And if you have any others, just post them in the chat. You do have panelists. Can I refer you to, whilst our erstwhile attendees are populating their answers, could you just quickly scan through any of the questions that are pertinent so we can pick those up throughout the remainder of the webinar there? I notice that people are raising their hands, which is fantastic, but we won't have time to unmute your microphone and actually digest your question there. So if you could pose those in the Q&A, that will be fantastic there. Okay, let's share the results there. So still, Felix, reliant on manual processes is the top answer there. We talk about technology adoption a lot. We talk about tech stack. We talk about obviously gearing up and calibrating your risk and controls, but still, something's getting lost in translation here.
Yes, absolutely. I think the point currently is that although many firms have taken huge steps in automating key processes, there are always certain steps which are kind of left behind, and those ultimately will act as bottlenecks in the process. So, for example, transaction monitoring, even if your system is effectively generating transaction monitoring alerts, you currently still need humans to process those alerts, not only just for bodies behind desks, but staff who've been appropriately trained to understand AML risk typologies are able to recognize those and escalate those appropriately. So I think the more that we automate, the more it becomes clear where those areas are that still require some manual input. And again, firms are attempting to sort of apply AI to these issues, but all they're doing is just ending up with a smaller population of processes that require manual intervention. They're not eliminating them entirely. So firms will always have this kind of struggle to kind of always have these bottlenecks in their processes, and that will have an impact on things like skills gaps, budget constraints, resourcing.
Philip, what we see, that's spot on, Felix. What we see is that when you apply AI to any sort of big process, it filters out, let's say, a lot of the dross. Yeah. So it filters out a lot of dross. What's left is all the difficult stuff. So in the past, where you might have had 100 people dealing with a cross section of stuff, yeah, now you've got 100 people dealing with all the difficult stuff. So it super exposes competency gaps, and we see it in all walks of life. But in particular, large shops that are processing lots of voice traffic, yeah, or chat. Once you apply system or machine learning to take out, let's call it the easy stuff, the repetitive easy stuff, you are inherently left with more complicated stuff, and firms just aren't investing appropriately to deal with that.
That's what we talk about. I mean, the second issue that people are struggling with, or firms are struggling with, Mark, is that complexity of threats, that convergence of threats there, and it's really difficult to manage and control, especially for smaller firms who are expected to have systems and processes in place. And the issue of proportionality therefore comes into it, doesn't it? What works and what doesn't work, and being very selective about that, all the while making sure that there's a budgetary limitation, isn't there, around that. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are people shouting on this webinar at us and saying, but you know what, where's the proportionate approach that the regulators are expecting us to take on these issues?
Yeah, I think it's certainly challenging. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A that refer, and someone raised in the chat, you know, their focus was on market abuse, and that was, you know, I think that was Bav said that tackling market abuse is a top priority for us. Somebody else was asking about, you know, well, what's the real risk that I'm running in an insurance and GI, general insurance intermediary? So I think that there's no one size fits all answer to this, but I think if you think about maybe on the GI point, what are the financial crime risks there? Well, clearly the firm is concerned that it's going to be defrauded and there'll be fraudulent claims. Clearly there are people who may pay up front for some sort of policy, and then we'll very quickly unwind it and have a repayment, and maybe give you 2 separate payment terms. And again, it depends on your jurisdiction. You know, in Hong Kong at the moment, there are lots of mainland Chinese people coming over and buying insurance policies because, but sort of on the investment side, because it's rather attractive for them to do it at the moment. So it really depends on what your firm is doing in terms of how does it make its money, how does it participate in the value chain, and then trying to predict the threats that you might have. And take the GI example again. You know, again, we might have thought about that as being quite a low risk area, but when you add in the consumer duty around producing good outcomes for your clients, you overlay that over, say, your approach to fraud in claims, and that becomes potentially quite a complicated area. We haven't touched quite on the cyber risk yet, but I think you know, if you've got a large GI organization that has lots of personal data, lots of different bits of bank account information and things like that, then you could be the target of a cyber criminal who is looking to steal those identities. You know, typically then, if I'm a GI intermediary, I might have a national insurance number or a driving license or something like that. So those, even for something that we traditionally see as pretty low risk, I think that complexity of threat is certainly there. So that sort of, you know, 58% is quite a I don't think unreasonable. And then of course that increases exponentially as you go into the higher risk areas of our financial services sectors.
Okay, we've got the fear of God in most people for the first part of this webinar. So let's give them some hope and some help in terms of like strengthening their approach to compliance and there. So on the screen, we've got a typical cycle of strengthening, firms' attitudes as well as approach to financial crime compliance in 2024. And Felix and Adrian, do you want to just pick out one or two points on this diagram where you think X marks the spots for firms to prioritize and focus on in 2024?
Yes, sure. I'll sort of start at the beginning of the process. So looking at point one, I think firms in 2024 need to take a step back and consider what are the financial crime risks they face. Within money laundering, sanctions, terrorist financing, fraud, market abuse. Map those out and determine what specific risk events they should be concerned about. And then understand whether they have in place appropriate controls against each of those risks to appropriately manage those risks. At the moment, firms are sort of effectively kind of just taking this approach in many cases, where they simply adopt what the next firm is doing, or what, more accurately, maybe what those compliance officers at that firm were operating in their previous firm, without really thinking about what makes this firm especially risky. What kind of customers do you deal with? What kind of jurisdictions are we associated with? And is tax evasion something we need to be specifically worried about? So I think, again, mapping out all those, that kind of universe of risk, and really thinking carefully about what controls they have in place. And that comprises both a sort of a quantitative element in terms of coming up with a theory, gathering data present in the firm, testing that theory to understand whether that risk event is really something which is occurring, but also a qualitative element. So again, just potentially sort of reading information that the FCA is releasing, looking at thematic reviews, understanding what similar firms in that space are doing and how they're managing their risks.
Your focus, Adrian.
Yeah, for me, I think when we talk about the compliance professionals, or that cadre of individual that's on this sort of webinar, I think the quality and the standards and the competence is already really, really high. And I don't think that's what Sarah Pritchard's talking about here. I think it's more the rank and file, and it's using their human knowledge and instincts to interpret clues. This is the day-to-day business. This isn't the compliance community. This is the rank and file. And this, for me, is where a lot of the war will be lost, to be honest, because I'm not convinced that firms are doing the training, but they're not doing what's required to help individuals translate that training into in-real competence, particularly when those firms are working hybrid and all the old traditional, learning on the job, peer-to-peer learning stuff is hugely diluted. So for me, that's where the focus needs to be, ensuring that your first line is actually authentically competent and can operate as a line of defense and can understand what's going on.
And on that note, we deliberately and intentionally put in a couple of slides around AML compliance, and I posted in the chat what Emily Shepherd said a couple of months ago, and you can read that at your heart's content there. To succeed, the right policies, controls, processes, and incentives are necessary, but not sufficient on their own. Cascaded strategies and purposes need to align to both positive action and consequence management when necessary. That talks of a robust culture, Adrian, that is needed to drive these systems, processes, and controls that both Mark and Felix have been talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. So some of our customers on the webinar today, they'll be very familiar with our approach, which is one of continual assessment. I think in our world, that continual assessment it's a continual assessment of employee competence. But generally speaking, firms will be running a continual assessment, like Felix referred to earlier. They'll be running continual assessment of transactions. Yeah, the non-human side of stuff that will be common to most firms on this webinar. Our component is the weak link. The bit that's not happening is a continual assessment of the employee base's competence in relation to these changing risks. And it has to happen. You do it everywhere else. Why would you do it with your people? You need to do it with your people. And as I say, there's many firms on the webinar who are already doing so. So for me, it's got to be continual assessment, but it can't be point in time. How is that sensible when everything's changing? I mean, if you listen to these guys, Mark and Felix, everything's changing every day. So you've got to stay on your game. You can't do it once a year, which is what a lot of firms would do with their people.
We know that poor culture undermines AML controls and approaches, Felix and Mark. But I'm quite interested to know from our audience members where you see, so we've got 6 TARs on the slide there, where you think that perhaps there is a need in your firm for improvement or an upgrade or enhancement. Is it tone from the top, basically tone from the middle, training and communication, employee incentives, rewards for good behavior, positive culture, driving a positive culture? Is it real-time monitoring, or is it resourcing and culture? Where do you see perhaps the biggest wins or the biggest gains that you could post in your organization, suggest in your organization? Just put the number in the chat, whether it's 1 tone for the top or 6 real-time monitoring, and let's see if we can get a quick litmus test of where you're at the moment. But Mark, for you, where do you think firms could, do with a supercharged boost, to use a terminology that the regulator has now used?
Yeah, I think it ties in with somewhat of the previous slide as well, and really bringing the whole firm into this fight. We've got tone from the middle there. I think that is super important. This idea of management permafrost and protecting their own little sector. I think what we've seen though is it's really, really important to get the whole firm working in all of these areas and thinking about them, and then you can really drive a really good risk management culture and things like that. I saw there a couple of people highlighting 3, training and communications. I think that education piece and that continual education piece, we want people to be able to not just follow rote some process, but to think about the risks of what they're doing in a much more educated and informed way. And if they do that, then you start to really, again, build that risk management culture.
Felix, I don't know whether you're seeing, I've got so many numbers in front of me now. It looks like Johnny Bowl, think of a number. And so in terms of, I see a number of 6s there. Is that where you're angling towards, into like responses, audio responses? And if so, where does we talked about the business-wide or firm-wide risk assessment there. That is critically important in making sure that you're setting the tone correct and appropriately for the year ahead.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one, certainly number 6. I think maybe not 6 specifically, but I certainly think as a sort of a broader theme, this issue of measuring compliance culture and producing management information to understand the sort of the real sentiments of the people in the middle who are actually operating those first line controls, those second line controls, is extremely important. I think it's very, very interesting to see the previous poll, the 2 areas which were highlighted as areas where firms were struggling least to meet their financial crime obligations was in terms of a weak AML culture and instances where resources were unaware of the actual risks they are managing. Now, the question is, are those 2 areas actually the sort of the lowest priority areas, or is there a disconnect between what senior leadership, as represented on this call, thinks and what the actual employees on the ground think about their AML culture and the risks they manage? And I think that kind of view that there might be a disconnect there is extremely important. And I think it kind of strengthens that idea that we do need senior management to be more engaged with what their resources are actually thinking about, what they actually know, feeding that information back up so that senior management can take the appropriate steps to enhance the compliance culture.
And to make that happen, we need a mixture and a blend of lagging indicators, but also leading indicators, Adrian.
Yeah, certainly from our perspective, most firms are craving leading indicators. Most firms work in a lag indicator environment, i.e. it's happened, crime's been committed, let's learn from it. Yeah, but then another crime gets committed, let's learn from it. In our world, and I saw the point 3 I saw come up a great deal on the previous component, which is bolt on, bolt in. Yeah, is it actually woven into the fabric of the organization? I think that's critically important, and I think a key point on the risk radars of the professionals on this webinar should be getting, let's just come right on front, right over the screen. Well done, Philip. So a key point would be finding leading indicators. What are the leading indicators that you've got in your business? Where can you see things going wrong? And when I sit down with C-suite individuals, most of the time they're shaking their head saying, we have hardly any. Most of it is after the shutting the stable door, whatever the phrase is, after the horse is bolted. One of the benefits AI can give you certainly in our world is we can give you a forward-facing risk radar. Yeah, so we can give you lead indicators of where your weaknesses are and where you're most exposed.
Mark, when we talk about financial crime compliance teams being on the front foot, must being proactive, adaptive, and innovative, it's jolly hard, isn't it, for firms to be spinning those plates and keep spinning, and keep a forward-looking viewpoint, but also making sure that you're actually picking up perhaps where you've got breaches and challenges and controls that need to be enhanced, not necessarily kicked out, but enhanced or strengthened. That it's easy for us to condense this in a 50-minute webinar and say this is the X marks the spot, but life on the ground is tough, isn't it?
Yeah, and keeping it going year on year. We talked about real-time monitoring. Well, this is also a marathon, not a sprint. You need to be sustainable, be bringing your people along with you over time. One area that we do see a little bit creeping into some firms, not many, but some firms, a little bit of groupthink about people doing this year on year and thinking that because we did it last year and we haven't, as far as we know, had a risk incident, then we'll just carry on doing the same thing. And that's where somewhere like Boval coming in and doing a quick tire kick is quite helpful. But otherwise, the challenge really is to keep your people enthused and not fall foul to the Friday afternoon fraud. There's a reason why most frauds happen on a Friday afternoon. It's because people's attention drops. And trying to keep people's attention on this, their focus, their interest, is a challenge.
Well, if you'd like to tire kick, in Mark's words, an opportunity to review and improve your financial crime controls, you can do so by indicating on the screen a health check and that you'd like Boval to conduct for you and with you. You can discuss that with them and we'll pass on those details to them. But if you want to actually strengthen your approach to financial crime compliance as well, there's an invitation to discuss with Caponelli, home of Elephants Don't Forget, and that opportunity there, as well as an opportunity to download and access a range of papers, blogs, insights, podcasts, and webinars of this caliber and quality as well. We have run out of time, which is always Adrian's mantra for saying we always run out of time, and I'm going to take the words right out of your mouth there. But thank you very much indeed, Team Boval, Mark Spiers, Felix Johnston, and also Elephants Don't Forget CEO Adrian Harvey. Thank you very much indeed for this webinar. A poll questions and the results of the poll questions will be posted to you alongside a PDF version of the slide deck as well. And if you'd like any further information, please do reach out to Felix and Mark directly. Look at those hearts and claps. Goodness me, it's only Monday. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.